the U.S. dollar reserve, Russia, and World War III. Now, that's a big topic, and we have a big conversation. And I'm going to take you through it from the macro down to the micro. So we are sitting down into an amazing conversation with Dave Collum. He's a professor at Cornell University. He's a libertarian. He's an Austrian business cycle analyst. He's a contributor at Zero Hedge. And we have this conversation, and we are going to start with the geopolitical picture. You have to understand it there. And then we'll dive into the macroeconomic picture. We'll dive then into the financial markets and then the economy. What is the Ukraine and Russia war happening over there? What is Putin going to do? What's going on with NATO? What's the U.S.'s involvement? How does that tie in with Afghanistan? What happens with the World Economic Forum? How are they tied in? Of course, we keep digging in. What's happening with the macroeconomic cycle? Can the Fed continue to stimulate, or will they continue pulling back? What does he expect with inflation, with the economies, and the cost of your gasoline and your steak? We are going to go from the macro to the micro. This is a conversation you do not want to miss with Dave Collum. Let's go ahead and jump right in. All right, so Dave, as I was just saying, I've listened to you a lot with other people that I do content with, and I love your perspective, and so I'm super excited to have you on. What I want to do, and I read your paper, or some of your paper, of your 2022 recap. It was big. It was very comprehensive. I really like that. But I want to start really wide, and then we'll kind of try to see if we can hone this in. I think a lot of people are looking down at the ground, and they can't see the big picture. And right. Because we're in a complex system, right? The world's a complex system. We have to look at the big pieces to understand the small pieces. So we'll start with this. Maybe this is too ambitious. We'll see what we can do in this short period of time. But start with maybe the big geopolitical picture, into more of the macroeconomic picture, and then maybe get into some more of the economic and market pictures, and see if we can kind of drill that down. But certainly this macroeconomic, or really the geopolitical picture, is driving things right now. And really, the big escalation is the Russia-Ukraine situation. Right. So I think it's been going on for a long time, but let's start with that because this is a big deal, potentially World War III. It seems like we've crossed the line. For everybody listening, we're recording this on January 27th, just so you know where we're at. And you put a quote out, and you said, "I just want to remind you that when NATO supplied sophisticated weapons manned by skilled NATO troops," which is what the U.S. has been doing, or NATO's been doing, "this is no longer a Ukraine-Russia conflict." And so Russia has said as much, right? They've kind of put the proverbial red line many times, which we've crossed. And this was one of those. If you give these weapons, we are now at war with you. So what were you meaning by that quote? And maybe expand on that a little bit.
Well, so our weapons are so sophisticated, we don't just hand them to Ukrainians like with some M16 or something and say, go shoot someone. I've been told that some of these weapons take as many as 90 people to man. And so when we hand over one of our real state-of-the-art weapons, we're not giving them to a bunch of guys who've been running around the outback of Ukraine to shoot these things. And so in all probability, this really is a direct conflict between let's call it NATO, but NATO is the United States in many, many respects, for better, for worse. It really is a sort of a direct NATO-Russia conflict where the Ukrainians are about as important as the Irish were to Longshanks.
This final red line or whatever where we're at, giving these weapons really highlights that. But was there really any doubt in your mind before?
Well, in part, no. I had started watching Putin with curiosity around 2014 or 15. I think what caught my attention was probably the CIA-led coup in Ukraine that then caused friction to pick up speed. A coup said by John Pilger, the British journalist, and George Friedman, founder of Stratfor. They said it was the most blatant engineered coup in history, which is quite a high bar. I think I'll just assume your audience doesn't know everything. That's probably a good assumption. Yeah. To understand the Ukraine war, the very first thing you have to do is go back a decade and look at friction between Russia and Ukraine. So when the Soviet Union fell apart, there was a lot of tension, right? So this was an unsettled world, and Germany was reuniting, and not only was Russia uncomfortable by that because big Germany has been known to get into trouble on occasion. Um, but even the rest of the world sort of was watching Germany going, we've been here before. Do we really want to let these guys form one big country again? So it turns out many well-documented statements were made between NATO and Russia in which NATO said, look, we will not push NATO eastward if you don't try to rebuild the Warsaw Pact. And there was an agreement. And then within no time at all, secret negotiations started trying to expand NATO eastward. And the move was finally, my understanding is the first move was Clinton in 1997, in which George Kennan, one of the truly legendary Cold Warriors from our State Department, said was the most disastrous policy blunder in U.S. history, and pushing NATO eastward. And so Russia kept pushing back, saying, look, you can't be doing this. You agreed. And we kept saying, we don't care. And in fact, one of the reasons that we didn't care is because there was no longer a Soviet Union to keep us in check. So one time Jeffrey Sachs said, look, there'll be a Marshall Plan to help Russia. What he failed to realize is, well, without there being a Soviet Union, there's no reason for us to help Russia. So in any event, so we started pushing NATO eastward, and Russia got increasingly uncomfortable. And we started training Ukrainian nationalists around 2014 or 15 after we toppled probably Putin's guy who was in charge in Ukraine. Toppled him, put in our own guy whose short name is Yats, that's what they call him. And Yatsenuk, I think is the full name. Hard to pronounce some of these things. Famous Victoria Nuland quotes in which she got recorded art engineering Yats's placement and power and stuff like that. So, excuse me, over the next years, we armed the Ukrainians, we trained them, and it was all about pushing back against Russia. That's all it was. And so I get irritated with the yellow, blue flag waving. I call them the sanctimony industrial complex because they think that this war is just about good and evil, and that Russia's evil and the Ukraine's good. And therefore we should help the Ukrainians and get all teary-eyed. And that there's just not a shred of truth in that story.
Yeah.
Ukraine is not a democracy by any stretch of the imagination. Zelensky is by no means an honest man by any stretch of the imagination.
And that's not controversial. That's not controversial.
Well, it is to the flag wavers, but yes, it's not controversial to the written record.
Yeah.
And Zelensky kicked the Catholic Church out of Ukraine, kicked all the political parties out of Ukraine, kicked the various media outlets out of Ukraine. So he's a ham-fisted punk.
Yeah.
And the Ukrainian nationalists turn out to be Ukrainian Nazis. Now, I don't use the word Nazi metaphorically. They're actually Nazis.
Mm-hmm. Socialists.
Yeah, they trace back to World War II when the Ukrainian Nazis fought with Germany against Ukraine and against Russia. And the Soviet Union, and they still celebrate Stepan Bandera's birthday, who is a famous Ukrainian Nazi. And so the CIA apparently looked at the Ukrainian Nazis and said, well, this is the group we're going to have to work with because these are the guys who they're tenacious. My best analogy, and again, I pretty much started from scratch at one point here. It's not like I got a PhD in government or something. The Ukrainian Nazis, in some sense, are kind of like a Mexican drug cartel, in which what they lack in numbers, they make up in savagery. And so what people who wave the flag and get all weepy-eyed don't understand is that the Ukrainians of the West, who are, we'll call them Ukrainians if you wish, were against the Ukrainians in the East, were essentially ethnic Russians. These guys spoke Russian, they acted Russian, they felt Russian, and they really would comfortably just be assimilated by Russia, I think. I think that's a safe statement. The Western Ukrainians have been slaughtering the Eastern Ukrainians for the last 10 years using CIA-led armaments. And so there's an estimated 15,000 dead Eastern Ukrainians. The idea that Putin was going to move into Ukraine because of NATO might actually not be quite correct. in the sense that leading up to the war, Putin kept saying, look, here's the deal. You can't have Ukraine. NATO can't have Ukraine. For us, it's an existential risk. It'd be the equivalent of if the Soviet Union put missiles along the Mexican border. We say, no, you just can't do that. If you put missiles along the Mexican border, I asked the rhetorical question, how long would it take us to turn Mexico into a sheet of glass? The answer is 5 seconds. I don't know. It wouldn't take long. And so Putin was crystal clear. And you say, well, he doesn't have the right to say that. I go, look, for him, it's existential risk. You say, oh, no, it's not. NATO's purpose is to oppose Russia, to oppose the former Soviet Union. They are, by definition, existential risk. Now, they don't have to be acting badly. They might be acting in good faith at times, but they are existential risks. Well, we got arrogant. We decided not only did we not agree with Russia, but we did not care what they think. And that's the problem. So we ceased to be valid negotiators. We ceased to sit at the table and say, okay, let's horse trade. Let's work something out here. We said, screw you. And so over the years, it just got worse and worse and worse. And leading right up to the war, Putin saying, I don't know how to get through to you guys, but this is not going to end well if you keep doing this. And we insisted. So
he drew the proverbial red line and we crossed it.
That's right. And his red line was a legitimate one.
Yeah.
And so in my opinion, that NATO could have stopped this war at any point. I put the blame of the war essentially 100% on NATO. It's not to say that Russia's not a bunch of tough punks, but I put the blame squarely on NATO. And we were looking for the war, and we don't care if Ukrainians die, because that's not what we're worried about. We're worried about something. Now, where it gets sketchy is, what do we want out of it?
Yeah, that's what I want to dig into. So I want to dig into that. So I think a couple things that I would add to that. So I've tried to do as much research as I can, and that seems to be kind of the conclusion I come to. But I think there's also a little bit more, just to kind of throw in a little bit of a flavor here. You mentioned a lot of them in the West seem to be Russians, and so to your point, they were
the East.
The East, and they were being shelled, right? They were being attacked. They were being killed, and so Russia's like, wait a minute, these are our people. Like, you can't just kill our people. We must do something to protect them. So there was even more than that. But let's go back to why. And so if we look at the big geopolitical picture, a couple things kind of come out. One is like, who controls the Eurasian landmass? I think there was always something about potentially trying to keep Germany and Russia apart from each other. I think there's something there. But ultimately, it seems like, to me, and correct me if I'm wrong, but let's get into the why, but it seems like we've had this push towards globalism. And when Trump went into Davos and said, hey, the U.S. is sovereign, we're not going to bow down, he was the number one target. And Putin also has given similar speeches, and he doesn't want to go with globalism either. And it seems like Ukraine might have been the tool they need to get Russia out of the way to continue to push towards globalism. That's kind of what I'm thinking, but what do you think is why they want to do this so bad?
Well, this gets to this whole debate about the Great Reset and things that, someone like Tom Luongo talks about and reads about all day, every day. I don't yet know what the Great Reset is. I have read enormous amounts about it. They're so garishly open about what they say they are that I go, you're just trying to drive us crazy, right? When they say, look, we're going to eat crickets, we're not going to own anything, the U.S. is not going to be a superpower. These are all fighting words. Now, I can understand why someone might want to go there, but I'd be careful about going there if it were me. Now, we have a fundamental problem.
Just the EU, I believe last week, approved putting cricket protein powder into foods. There's been no testing on it, and they just approved it. So This is happening, and it's coming right now, like in Europe this week.
And we have this problem where the World Economic Forum guys really have infiltrated most of the Western governments. So take, for example, Canada. Trudeau's totally owned. Trudeau and his family have a history of supporting totalitarian regimes for the last half century. Trudeau is the perfect puppet, right? He's such a dork. And but his second in command, Chrystia Freeland, turns out to be Ukrainian. Turns out she was a reporter in Ukraine. Her father was a Ukrainian Nazi, and she's on the short list to be Secretary of NATO. Her resume is a problem from head to toe. She's the one who squashed the truckers. She's up to no good. You got Biden. Biden is so compromised by both Ukraine and China. And it's not to say other presidents don't have skeletons in the closet, but he's so compromised that when he does something that makes no sense, you don't know who told him to do it. And when we pulled out of Afghanistan, for example, it was the most absurd pullout in history. Our military knows how to get out of countries, right? Mm-hmm. They do know how to pull out, and they did it in what seemed like the most unimaginable way. Mm-hmm. And then the question is why? And that story turned out to have a huge amount of propaganda in it, because remember when they pulled out and we left civilians behind, and it looked like it was going to be a hostage crisis 2.0. It looked like it was just be a nightmare. We left them weapons, we left them money, we left them everything. And what we also noticed is that after we pulled out, nothing happened. So this horror story of the pullout all of a sudden just disappeared completely. Yeah. The question is, what's that all about? Well, I think because all the actors are sane. And we said to the Taliban, we're going to leave you money and weapons and you name it, but don't make us come back and kick your ass because you start beating on Americans. Yeah. And the Taliban said, okay, we're up with that. And so now the Taliban controls. Now the Taliban's cutting mineral rights deals with China now. Mm-hmm. So heaven only knows if Biden knew that was the path the whole time.
And we also know now, we also see reports this week that now Russia is making deals with the Taliban to get a lot of those weapons.
That's right.
So now by proxy, we've given weapons, left them to the Taliban, which are now going to Russia, and then we're also supplying Ukraine with weapons.
And maybe we knew that would happen the whole time. That's the problem.
I'm sure you dig into history a lot, and if you look into the history of World War I mean, that's what the richest people in the U.S. did, right? They supplied both sides of the war.
Yeah, and things like the Archduke Ferdinand assassination being the trigger of World War I. That's not even close to true. Mm-hmm. The Germans could not get the Austrians to counterattack because the Archduke was a dork. Mm-hmm. No one cared about the Archduke. Shoot him, we don't care. The Germans basically had to beg the Austrians to pick a fight with the Serbs, and so they did, and then now we're off to World War I. So there hasn't been a war since the beginning of the 20th century that I know of that wasn't started under false pretenses. So.
And it's interesting when you talk about that. A lot of times people would say that assassination of the Archduke was the start of the war, but really the war started at least a year, if not 2 years earlier. And so the beginning and the end of a war is oftentimes not really when it started and ended. World War II didn't start with the bombing of Pearl Harbor again, for example. And so, did this war, if we are going into World War III, did it start with Russia's attack on Ukraine, or did it start a lot sooner?
Well, it started decades earlier, potentially, but it certainly you can easily start the preparations for 2014. Mm-hmm. And there's photos of Klobuchar and Lindsey Graham and John McCain sitting with Ukrainian soldiers rallying the troops to go against Russia back in 2015, 2016, and we were training troops in Ukraine for what's called interoperability, which means that you can plug any unit into any other unit and be able they can work together. And so we have been training Ukrainians to go and get slaughtered on the battlefield for a decade now. And now here's the problem. We hear things like the Russians blew it, their tanks don't work, the Ukrainians have the ball on the 2-yard line and are about to score, none of which you can demonstrate to be true.
Right.
Now, if you turn to guys like John Mearsheimer, who's been warning us for over 12 years now that we were pushing the U.S. into World War III, pushing Russia into World War III. You look at a guy named Colonel McGregor, who was sort of White House level military guy. He didn't get there, but he was close. He's saying that the Ukrainians are getting slaughtered, not winning. The retreats that we were hearing about early in the war, the Ukrainians are pushing them back. Scott Ritter had said right from the start, the Russians are going to bait the Ukrainians into the cities, get them, and then as soon as they get them to defend the cities, back out, go around the cities, because Putin got his ass kicked politically during the Chechen war when body bags were coming home. And so Putin said, okay, casualties are not going to be accepted if they get too high. So Putin did not want to fight urban war, and so he baited them into trying to fight an urban war. Then he ran around from there, got to Mariupol, and bombed the living tar out of the Azov battalion.
Yeah, I think also if those narratives were true that they were losing, Russia was losing so hard, we wouldn't have to keep sending more and more weapons as well. But I want to jump back to like why and ultimately like where does this go, and not just with the war, but with macroeconomics and so forth, even into the United States. And so if we look at this, like the thing that just I'm just disgusted with. I have kids, and so I always think about this. But like, and I'm old enough to have grown up under the Cold War, and so I'm looking at potentially the threat of a nuclear war more real than I've ever seen in my lifetime. Like we're literally going there now. Russia is saying, hey, look, this could lead to nuclear war. And if Putin's as bad as we think he is, I mean, if he's about to die, right, if there's no victory for him, then why wouldn't he? Maybe there's some false flags to bait them in. I mean, we can go down this road. But I think about this risk of this potential nuclear war that we have. And the fact that Biden and NATO are putting all of us, myself, my kids, in jeopardy of this over who controls Crimea? Like the whole world, the 8 billion people are at risk because we care about who controls Crimea? That can't be the truth.
That's
right.
That's right.
Can't be the truth. Right. So then what is? And then and it's important to understand that, because then what happens with moving from a unipolar world to a multipolar world, and how does this break out? And then we have to look at how moving. Putin talks about moving from a fake financial system into a real asset system, right? So moving from fake fiat money to a commodity-based money, and then how does that affect us? So that's why I'm trying to think of this downstream effect there.
Well, so this gets to this whole Davos crowd, Great Reset. Who knows what they're? I mean, the fact that they're talking about these things is evidence, therefore, that they are trying to confound us, right? They're not telling us the secrets, and so they are trying to keep us confused and arguing and debating topics. So there's simple sort of first order approximation explanations like U.S. and NATO, but let's call it the U.S. would like to get the resources of both Ukraine and Russia. So if we can install our guy, all of a sudden our industries can go ripping into Russia again, ripping into Ukraine again, and grab the assets. First order approximation 2, we're worried that China's going to do that, and so we got to get there first. First order approximation 3, the U.S. hegemon is falling apart. This is a desperate effort to keep it together. But meanwhile, we've got a reserve currency risk. We've got the Saudis talking very seriously about kicking us to the curb. And so the petrodollar story falls apart. Next thing we know, we've got a massive inflation problem. We've got a massive lack of alliances in the world problem. There's theories out there that the U.S., this came from Condoleezza Rice or something from about a dozen years ago. It wasn't Condoleezza, someone else, that said that the U.S.'s biggest fear is an alliance between Germany and Russia because of Germany's technology and Russia's resources. Yeah. And so bombing the pipeline, on the one hand, looks like it's to sever that. My opinion is it looks like it would strengthen it, because if I were Germany, I'd kick us to the curb.
Yeah.
If I were Germany, I'd be so unbelievably mad that the U.S. blew up that pipeline. And if you're listening, you say, well, we don't know the U.S. blew up the pipeline. I say, get a CAT scan. You're an idiot, right? Jesus Christ.
We've all watched enough murder mysteries or detective shows on TV.
Well, we also watched the former Polish defense minister thank the United States for doing it.
Yeah.
So he thinks we did it. So that's enough for me at this point.
I would say it certainly has to tie back to NATO, and there's no way a NATO country would do it without the U.S. knowing about it. I mean, that just seems...
And our Navy was over the pipeline the previous month,
So, I mean, there's a lot there. On top of the whole pipeline situation, what we've seen now, a growing disconnect between Europe and the U.S., specifically France and Germany, because of this Inflation Reduction Act, and now onshoring stuff, and now that's making people buy American, and so now Europe feels like they've been kicked to the curb. And so all of this is changing. This is rapidly changing. We have, you mentioned Saudi potentially, kind of breaking the petrodollar and creating this yuan, petro yuan or whatever. I think that's kind of like a done deal, in my opinion. I mean, we see that.
It looks
like that's going to happen. And so which we're on this path, and I think we continue, the BRICS nations continue to rise. China, interesting enough, I don't know how much, I think you pay attention to the gold market. China just announced that they added 30 tons of gold. And why would they announce it? They certainly didn't just buy that. Why would they announce that right now? We see what Russia's adding in gold. You see what's happening with the petro yuan, the BRICS nations. There's certainly competition going for the currency and reserve hegemon, to your point. Do you think that continues? I mean, is that where you see things going?
Well, certainly Russia and China are acting like a gold standard could be in our future. They're not bashful about accruing gold. I have seen estimates, and again, I've seen estimates that are just stupid estimates of anything imaginable, right? Anything you can think of, there's an estimate suggesting that out there. But I've seen estimates that China might have as much as, say, 80,000 tons of gold. Now, that puts it a factor of 10 higher than other estimates.
Yeah.
But let's just say that China's got a lot of gold, and part of it's because the sovereign-owned companies are also gold hoarders. So they might not show up as official gold reserves, but at the same time, if they're owned by the state, then they are official gold reserves.
Right.
So I would say that it looks to me like someone wants to topple the dollar, therefore someone wants to topple the U.S. hegemon. I'm reading a book right now called The Sovereign Man, which someone put me onto. It's 1997. I thought it would be old and stale because the argument is that the tech
is it the sovereign
revolution,
individual?
I think it's The Sovereign Man. I'm listening to the audiobook, so I don't see the title often enough.
I think it's The Sovereign Individual, potentially. It was written in
by Rees-Mogg. Rees-Mogg. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Okay, so I got the yeah, and I thought it would seem stale because I'm going, oh, they're going to be talking about Yahoo or something at that point. It's actually brilliantly and timelessly done. Another great one is the True Believer, which I highly recommend. There's books that just get into my DNA, and those, right now the Sovereign Individual is doing a fine job. And he makes the argument that we're in a 500-year rollover. So if you take, for example, the Roman Empire, and then you got the period of Charlemagne, then you got the period in which the church dominated the globe. So the church, and then it became too big, expensive, whatever, and then that gave way to sovereign states. He makes the argument we are in the beginnings of another rollover, and this is the digital world, which will be more distributed, less based on geographic borders, more based on digital connectivities. And I'm not a huge digital guy, so I don't yet own a Bitcoin. I say the word yet.
Yet.
I do. I do have ideas in my head as trigger points.
Yeah.
Right. And I do believe if it's a good idea, it will patiently wait for me. But I think the Bitcoin maximalists think this is going to happen in the blink of an eye, and it's not going to do that. I don't think it could. We get mushroom clouds, right? But we could be rolling over into a new world. And when the Roman Empire collapsed, they didn't know it was collapsing. It wasn't like, oh my God, It collapsed last night. What happened, right? It took centuries. They finally said, wait a minute, we kind of suck now. No one really noticed, but we suck. And so it's quite possible that the next 500 years. Now, if it takes 200 to get there, then why do we care, right? But the other thing is these big rollovers cause chaos. They are very violent, painful, upheaving rollovers, and even if they take 2 centuries, there's just a lot of trouble as the power structure readjusts. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And so then how do you plan for that? And Bitcoin, gold, get your affairs in order. There's things that you should assume may not be there that you've always assumed would always be there.
Yeah. So let's keep diving down deeper. So first of all, I just want to say something that I have this big thesis I pound the table on for the last, almost 2 years. 3 cycles converging. So to your point, this 500-year rollover, you can break it into 250-year cycles, and then there's 3 84-year cycles fit into a 250-year cycle. So you can kind of keep breaking it down. But on a 250-year cycle, it's like this pendulum swings from centralization to decentralization. So every 500, it turns over completely, to your
That's
point.
right. That's
so
right.
250
That's
years ago was the American and French Revolution, and then 250 years before that was the Protestant Reformation. And then we have an 80-year financial revolution cycle. So 80 years ago was the Bretton Woods Agreement.
So that's the classic fourth turning cycle right there.
The classic fourth turning cycle, generational theory cycle. There's a populist uprising or regime change cycle about every 80 years. So it all kind of fits within that. But the financial revolution cycle is different, right? So that was when the whole financial system reset. So this is like Ray Dalio's long-term credit cycles. And then on a 50-year cycle, a 40 to 60, but about a 50-year cycle is a technology revolution cycle or Kondratiev wave cycle. And so if you map these out, 50-year, 80-year, and a 250-year, but they're all three converging right now. So all that's happening right now, which is why things are going pretty crazy. I've done a lot of work on that. I got a ton of videos, so if you're watching this, you can go catch those on the channel. But if we keep diving down into this, you mentioned if they challenge the global hegemon, you were talking about Saudi Arabia, de-dollarizing the petrodollar, which appears to be done, in my opinion. It's going that way. And a lot of it is being forced, right? The dollar has become so weaponized. When Russia, one of three global superpowers, had their bank account seized, everyone took notice to that. And so that is certainly affecting the global hegemon, or it's certainly bringing down the dollar demand. Potentially, the dollar as the reserve currency status, because of the financial system we have, it's pretty robust, but we can leapfrog that with a CBD system like China's doing. And I guess the point I want to get to is you mentioned that could cause inflation. So inflation is the hot topic, obviously. It was transitory, and now it's a big problem. The Fed went on this crazy rate hiking cycle, the fastest we've seen in history. And now it's starting to plunge. And now they've decided to recalculate the CPI basket, and we could potentially get into deflation this year, or maybe not. What's your take on the inflation now aspect?
Well, every year I write about inflation. I've challenged people to give me examples of countries that inflated their way out of a serious debt. And it turns out it's hard to do. And so if you start thinking of some of the classic hyperinflations, they actually don't achieve that. So the Weimar inflation or Argentina or something like that, they end up in the end defaulting, which is a deflation. They end up just saying we're not paying. And so to me, that's a deflationary default. The Weimar Germany, they hurt their own countrymen with the inflation, but their foreign debt was denominated in gold. And so it led to World War II, not to a debt relief. The best example turns out to be post-World War II, the U.S., where we had a big war debt. We did financial repression on the U.S. bond market. Real rates got down to something like negative 10% then too. We tend not to hear about that chapter, and you say, oh, therefore you can inflate away your debt then by beating up the bond market, but you have to remember. I think this number is correct. I think the U.S. At that point was 80% of the global GDP. So to say, oh, we inflated away our debt and not mention the fact that we ran the world is just it's an oversight. It's a serious oversight. So I'm not convinced the Fed can inflate it away. I think it's like chasing your shadow. I think you never catch up. Now, we also know the inflation is not plummeting. You said plummeting. The CPI is plummeting, maybe.
Yeah, they changed the calculation. Yeah.
Well, it's a fraud.
Right.
I mean, so my brother's an accountant. He keeps track of everything, and his year-over-year food prices went up 41%.
Wow. Jimmy
Iorio said his restaurant 25%. Restaurant downtown, the guy says, I don't know the number, but it goes up every week. So we got eggs selling for $5 a carton. I used to buy ribeye for like $9 a pound. I bought a value pack, and now it's more like 18. These are very short time scales that these prices went up, and they're sticky. It's not like ribeye is going to go back to 9. Mm-hmm. We've got them. And so from this point on, I don't even know how Joe Sixpack's putting food on the table. I really don't know how they're doing it, because they were already just barely making ends meet.
Well, part of what they're doing is they're taking a lot less quality food, which then starts to lead to health problems and all types of other things. But it's got to be suffocating, because it's not like they were eating
prime rib,
Right.
and now they can downgrade to hamburger. I mean,
Right.
they're downgrading from hamburger.
Yeah.
And so then the question is, what are they downgrading to? I know a woman who said as a kid her entire life they ate just oatmeal.
Mm.
Well, they could be back there.
Yeah.
Just rice. Just who knows?
But if we look at, if you look back, well, first of all, back to the financial repression, the IMF put out a white paper in 2015, said that's kind of the way forward. BlackRock has put out a paper, way forward. And so basically for everybody listening that doesn't know what that is, you can go look it up. I've done several videos on it. But basically, inflation runs hotter than what the bond yields pay, and then they steal the middle, right? That's how they kind of inflate away their debt, which, to your point, worked well in World War II or in 1940s. Maybe not so well now, but that seems to be maybe the potential playbook. But I guess what I was asking, in regards to inflation, to the average consumer that has to put gas in their pickup truck and buy food at the store, they don't care what CPI says. They just care what the cash register says.
Right.
But the Fed seems to care because the Fed has a dual mandate, one of which is stable prices. And so if inflation's 9%, they look horrible. And so Jerome Powell says, we're committed to it, right? Bringing inflation back down. So if they recalculate, I don't know if you saw, the BLS announced they're changing the CPI calculation this month. Instead of using a 2-year comp, it goes to a 1-year comp. So now they just measure off of last year, which was the highest inflation in 40 years. And so just from changing that measure point, CPI comes down. So I guess the question is, if the Fed pulled the liquidity away, pulled the punch bowl away, and things start going to hell in a handbasket, by fudging the numbers, does that give them the cover they need to start easing back in, or at least pausing what they're doing?
I don't think so.
No,
because I think the Fed created what I probably 10 years ago created the monetary capacitor. So you keep charging it, and there's no current, and then bam, whack, it discharges. That's how a capacitor works. And I think the capacitor is discharging. And so you can't, inflation's in our DNA. If you ask a contractor, go find any contractor and say, okay, imagine you're going to build a house in 2 years. How much are you going to add on to your bid from today for 2 years from now to adjust for the increased costs of labor and materials? I've asked that question. The answer is around 30%. That means that contractor will put that 30% in there. And if you're a union negotiator, you're going to put a big raise in there. And so the inflation expectations have now taken hold. And now it is wired into the system for the price to go up. So maybe the inflation won't run like the way lumber ran in 2021 or something. But it's not to say it's not going to go 15% a year.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
and the CPI number is just garbage. I mean, it's just complete garbage.
And I agree. And so if I'm trying to build a house, I don't care what CPI says. I just care what the price of lumber is, and I have to figure out where it's going to be. But I guess the point that I'm trying to go back to is the Fed seems to be like focused on this 2 to 3% number. 9% is not sustainable. We know, Shadow Stats tracks the original basket from the 1980s. They say right now, the last reading was 6.45, 6.5%. Shadow Stats says it's 15.6.
As does the Chapwood Index.
Yeah. So we know real inflation is way more, to your point, maybe 30%. It depends on what you're buying, obviously, right? Depends on what your personal basket is. So we know it's way higher than what they tell us. I guess the question I'm asking, though, is it gets worse for consumers. Inflation continues to get worse. But if the CPI official number, which is a lie, if the CPI false number comes down to 3%, does the Fed go, okay, we've done our job, now we don't have to keep hiking?
Well, that's like a person who has stage 4 cancer. For some reason, they come up with a mechanism not to see it.
I know.
And saying, okay, we're not seeing the tumor now, we can stop the chemo.
Yeah.
So the facts don't change just because you come up with a new way to measure it. And so the answer is no. What'll happen is I also think that's not what the Fed's going to do. That's where I seem to be. I was on a panel discussion with guys who are way more experienced than me, and they were talking about things in a different language than I was. And I think Powell faces a dilemma. So Powell, starting probably 2 years ago, Stephen Roach wrote an article that really got legs, and I'm actually taking some credit because I shoveled it over to Zero Hedge for him, and that's a good place to get it. He compared Powell to Arthur Burns, who was a disaster. Mm-hmm. Now, as the chair of the Federal Reserve, you do not want to be compared to Arthur Burns. And when those headlines start appearing, when Larry Summers starts comparing you to Arthur Burns, and other players start comparing you to Arthur Burns, you got a problem in your own head, your personal head. So, as Peter Bookbar said, as one of the panelists said, the Fed was horribly embarrassed by the inflation. The word embarrassed was used. Mm-hmm. So here's what I think Powell's going to do. I think his name is no longer JPO. I think his name is going to be J Payne. And he is going to have to decide between being a supporter of markets and a destroyer of currencies, or a supporter of the integrity of the Federal Reserve and a destroyer of economies. And he's going to have to decide, does he want to be up in the pantheon of losers with Arthur Burns or with winners like Paul Volcker? And I believe Powell, being a human, probably pondering his legacy, I think he's told us he's going to cause pain.
Many times he said that, yeah.
And Volcker made big mistakes. Volcker took his foot off the throat of the market, and then inflation took off again. And Powell knows this. If Dave and Ithaca knows this, Powell knows this, and so he doesn't want to be the guy who then let inflation. It's like putting out 3/4 of a fire. Say, well, we'll let the rest just burn. Mm-hmm. It just doesn't make sense. And so he needs to put it out.
Powell has said so much. He said,
he
said the big mistake or danger is that we don't do enough, like a Arthur Burns. He said, I would rather go too far and break things because we have the tool to rebuild them.
That's the part that I think is a bit of a lie.
But they can't rebuild them.
I don't think. And here's the reason they don't have the tools, because here's the economic pitch, which I pieced together from a bunch of smart people and some of my own creation. We had a bull market that went from 81 to 2021. It was a 40-year run, had some stops along the way, but it was a great period. That bull market started and got its fuel from the boomers who were just entering the workforce.
Right, demographics.
The Russians, the Soviet Union was collapsed, and they needed capital, and all they had was resources, so they flooded the world with cheap resources. The Chinese, who came out of the dark ages and flooded the world with capital, with human resources. You've got interest rates that went from spectacularly high numbers because Volcker had to ramp them up. And they were able to march those rates down systematically for 40 years. Mm-hmm. And we have market valuations. This is the stunning part. People don't know this. I look at 25 different metrics of market valuations. The market valuation from 1981 to 2021, 40 years, the valuation rose 4% per year. That's a 4% tailwind that's not real growth. It's just increasing price. Now, what happens if the next 40 years we march the valuations down 4% a year every year? That'll be a 4% headwind. That's an 8% swing. Meanwhile, China's not going to be flooding more workers in the market. Russia is not going to be so desperate to sell resources. They have them, but it's not like the world's filled with resources now. And the boomer demographic is gone. So what part of this story is going to repeat?
Yeah, I mean, the demographic piece is really big. I've been following Harry Dent for a long time, and he wrote a book called The Demographic Cliff. There's been lots of books written about it. Peter Zion's pounding the table on that as well, and so that's a big piece.
So I don't trust Zion. I think his data is good, but I don't trust his motive.
Yeah, he seems like a CIA
I could be wrong. Yeah, he's got a neocon streak in him. But he's worth listening to. I read his book, but he's also got a confidence level that dwarfs my own.
I had him on, and I would agree. And unfortunately, his hubris, or to your point, his confidence level, kind of mutes. His smugness mutes some of the content. But his book is chock full of good data.
It's phenomenal, and it's a horror story.
Yeah,
it's a horror story.
And I believe most of it, but a lot of it you have, with every piece of content, you have to go, who's telling me? What are their motives? What are their biases? What's fact and what's opinion? But he does have a lot of good data, and you can draw your own conclusions, and so it's worthwhile. But to the point I was making is he kind of also talks about this, as other people do. I've read several books on demographics, and so if you increase the population, you increase the money supply, you get booms. When you
Right.
decrease the population and decrease the money supply, what happens? Well, it's the opposite.
So I just don't see any of the tailwinds, and we had a whole pile. I don't see any of them persisting. So I think that my base model for just being Joe Sixpack investor is we're going to have a generation long grinding bear market. And it'll have ups and downs, and it'll have rolling events. And here's what I like to remind people. Here's some benchmarks that are worth noting. One is that if you look at the inflation adjusted S&P, whether you start back in 1906 or you start back in 1929, both of which were market peaks, you ended up at exactly the same inflation adjusted price in 1981. So if you go from peak to trough, it can take between 40 and 75 years. All you got were dividends. That's all you got. Now, first half of the 20th century, you got 4%. That happens to be just about the number that Buffett says is all you can ever hope to get. Now, the modern dividends are more like 2%. And you go, well, that's a problem. I go, yeah, it's also the evidence that the market's 2x overvalued. Now, the second plot's a fascinating chart by a guy named Ron Grice. I don't know how to say his name because I've never talked to him directly. He plots the S&P versus the M2 money supply, which sounds like a much cleaner inflation metric, right? What a nice, just let's look at the money supply compared to the price of the equities. And it turns out that over the 20th century, they are dead flat.
Yeah.
Now they roll and weave and bob, but over 100 years, they don't move. And that means, once again, all you get are dividends.
Yeah. Yeah. I've seen those charts when you take the money supply or central bank balance sheets, divided by asset prices, specifically the stock market. S&P 500 seems to be a perfect proxy for that. I guess the one question I always ask though is like, over what time frame? So I agree with what you're saying. I agree with the demographic problem. I believe, kind of through these cycles thesis, I believe the world continues to decentralize, supply chains break down, that causes inflation, onshoring jobs, that causes inflation. So I agree with all of that, but that's like a long-term thesis. I'm thinking, and we also have, we saw firsthand in 2020, the markets, asset prices, and the economies do not equal each other anymore, right? We saw the economy literally shut down, businesses closed, and asset prices go to a new all-time high. And so it was kind of that K recovery they talk about. So while I agree Joe Sixpack is in for a world of hurt, and steak and gas will be more expensive, and I agree over the long term, you can't print your way out of this. It doesn't work for Zimbabwe or Weimar Republic. And so over a long time frame, I agree with that. But what about the short time frame? And so if CPI comes down to 2 or 3% in the next couple of months, if we get month-over-month deflation or even year-over-year deflation by Q3, which maybe looks like it could be possible, does the Fed go, well, shoot, it was $700 billion in 2008, it was $10 trillion or whatever, $5 trillion on the Fed in 2020, I guess let's go $10 trillion.
What if the markets decide that the Fed has completely lost their shit?
Yeah, they lose confidence.
Well, so that's the problem. So one of the things all those tailwinds I just described did is they produced like what I call the era of the V-bounce. We'd be cruising along in a phenomenal upward trajectory. And then something bad would happen. And all of a sudden, in what is a relatively short window of time, it would go down and plumb some low, which, by the way, was never really very cheap. And then it would spring right back and they'd go along for another chunk of time and they just V-bounce their way up. Well, you can do that if you have all these tools. But the Fed is pegged against zero. You can say, Fed funds rate. What's the Fed funds rate right now? What's the Fed funds rate?
4.5, 5.
Yeah, right. I remember when the Fed funds rate was 15 or 16.
Yeah.
So they had a lot of room to play around. Oh, let's tap it down to 13. Let's tap it down to 12. They could do stuff. If they cut the Fed funds rate and inflation takes off, they're screwed. They are so screwed because we'll say, the Fed is no longer got a dual mandate. They've given up the one mandate they were supposed. I don't even buy the dual mandate. I don't think the Fed's job should be anything but protect the currency. I think the dual mandate is something they got Congress to give to them. And I don't agree with it. I don't think the Fed should be worried about inflation. And they're not. So if we reach some point where we say, holy cow, the Fed is not driving the cab.
But what if they are? But what if they are worried about inflation, but they're using a wrong, faulty metric?
Then we know that they're incompetent, and we will lose faith in them.
But we know that.
And we will have a no.
Don't we know that already?
No,
I mean, you and I?
No, because
you still have confidence.
No, not me.
Yeah, right.
But
so we already know.
Read all the headlines. Everyone's asking, the Fed's gonna stop raising rates as soon as it gets problematic. They all think the Fed's gonna save them. Every market participant somehow seems to think that the Fed has this switch, and all they have to do is wait for the Fed to flip the switch, and it'll be sunshines and Skittles rainbows again. And I don't think that's true.
The Fed mouthpiece, Tim Rose, Wall Street Journal, Tim Rose said that we'll see.
I thought it was Nick Timmerose.
Yeah, Timmerose, yeah.
Tim Rose. Tim Rose. Oh,
Tim Rose.
I was picking up two names. I wasn't putting them together. Okay.
He said they're going to go back down to a 0.25 will be the next hike. So that's more of like a pause, not a flip the switch necessarily, but definitely coming off the 0.75 to a 0.25. And if you look at risk assets, they seem to be doing something, sniffing something.
Well, but then you got the Fed guys where Bullard will say we're going up and someone else will say we're going down. What these guys have been doing since Greenspan retired is they've been replacing Greenspan's legendary gobbledygook, the crap that he used to spew and say nothing, with a committee full of gunk.
Yeah, even more.
And so no sooner will Bullard say one thing, someone else will say something else. They've got to be coordinating. So it's got to be one of these things. Let's keep them guessing. It wasn't that long ago that the Fed didn't tell us what they were doing. Participants had to watch things, key indicators, say, oh, the Fed must be tightening. We didn't know that.
Yeah.
We had to infer they were tightening or easing. But now the whole world, the entire equity market is based on technical indicators now.
Yeah.
When was the last time someone said, we really think this is a good buy because the cash flow is great, right? If the cash flow is great, all these tech companies would be crap.
Yeah. Oh, for sure, they're disconnected. And then you could go into, and I don't want to get into that, but, then other people think that the Fed actually has no control, and there's a big piece of that.
Well, I think they could become the case, is my point.
Yeah. So I like to, I'm an Austrian economics, so I like to think of what Mises said. And then suddenly the people realize that inflation is both permanent and intentional. And then they lose it out, right? As the crack up boom, Right. And so that's the point that you're talking about. And I agree. At some point that happens and just kind of wins. So if we kind of just kind of distill this down, obviously we have no crystal ball. We're just sitting here having fun talking about it. But you think that the Fed is potentially, and I don't want to put words in your mouth, and so maybe you just tell me, like in the markets, stock markets, the risk assets, the liquidity, treasury liquidity, which I know there's a whole big problem there. Do you think this year continues to get worse, or do you think maybe they're kind of be able to pull off this magical soft landing?
I don't think there's such a thing as a magical soft landing. I think a year is too short a time scale for me. And so I do think if you make me bet, which I do have to because I have savings, I think this will probably be a bad year. That's my guess. The other thing to remember is that if every time the Fed does something spooky and the markets don't break, that emboldens the Fed into believing they can do some more now because they're desperate to get this crap back, right? They did, the Fed, by the way, without the Fed, there would have been no lockdown. If someone hadn't said to the Fed, we got to lock down, and the Fed said, okay, we'll get your back on the money side of things. We'll go direct. We'll do what BlackRock told us to in 2019, go direct, shove money into the consumer pockets. We'll help with that. If the Fed had said, screw that, too dangerous monetarily, you're on your own, there wouldn't have been a lockdown.
Hey, Dave, you just made the case for Bitcoin.
I did.
Separate money and state. Mm-hmm. Take the hands out of the thing of the government, what F.A. Hayek said. So just throw that in there.
No. I've never criticized. My concerns over Bitcoin are not the idea of Bitcoin. It's that the Bitcoin hodlers, I really sincerely believe, are going to have to do battle against the state, capital S. And what I'm watching for is either evidence that that's not going to have to happen. But I also worry that if you guys, if Bitcoin becomes normalized, you will lose what Bitcoin is meant to be somehow. They will absorb it like they did the Tea Party. They will absorb it like they did MAGA. They will find a way. Or I think they're going to at some point say, "Oh, Bitcoin's the currency of scoundrels. We'll step on it." And I know you guys can say you can't step on it because it's distributed. But if they say, "Look, you're going to go to prison for 10 years if you spend Bitcoin," most of us are out.
Let me just throw a couple things back at that real quickly. So one, our mutual friend Tom Longo, he talks about the Fed fighting against the ECB and the Davos group and all that, right? And so kind of to the first point, which is the governments or the central banks will never allow a money like Bitcoin to compete with them, and that would probably be true. Who wants to give up control over money, right? Control the money, control the world. Right. But then again, towards Tom's thesis is, well, the Fed doesn't want to give up control to the ECB.
Right.
And the Fed doesn't want to lose their autonomy to the Treasury, and the Treasury is going to need money. The Fed's not going to want to give it to them. And what about Japan's central bank, or what about China and the BRICS? And so there's way bigger factions and battles to be fought than a $400 billion asset today.
You expect Russell Crowe to step out into this battlefield? It's an unbelievable mess.
So I think there's a big fight before you ever get to Bitcoin. The other thing I would say about that is, then again, why would they want to allow someone to have this way to get out of the currency system? Well, nobody in the world believes they should. Well, almost nobody believes they should store their wealth in currency. So we put our money into gold or stocks or real estate or fine art or cars or collectibles or whatever. And Bitcoin is just one more of dozens of potential store of value assets that we have. So then that would be the Fed's going to take away every single store of value asset. And so that doesn't seem highly likely too.
No, I agree with that. The only problem with Bitcoin is the one that the advantages of Bitcoin are what bring it in the sights of the state.
Because it's
I don't mean just the Fed. I mean the Davos guys. Yeah, exactly. So
we know there's going to be a battle.
That's exactly right.
The last thing I'd say is to your point, and you made the case that they can't take it away, but they could say, we'll throw you in jail for 10 years, or we'll kill you on sight. They could say that as well. And since 1971, they've spent trillions of dollars on the war on drugs, and yet drugs, the number one cause of death in America today from 18 to 44 is fentanyl. And so how well has that worked?
There's no evidence they're trying to win that war.
Well, I know, but okay. So but my point is if they catch you with drugs, they put you in prison. Our prison systems are full of people for drug charges, and drugs are being done in prison. And so, they can't even stop drugs in prison. And to your point, if we catch you, we'll put you in jail. Well, if we catch you with drugs, we'll put you in jail. And when they tell someone like me and you that you shouldn't do drugs or we'll put you in jail, it doesn't make me want to do drugs. I don't want to do that. But if they say, hey, Dave, you don't have a right to store your wealth in a way we can't steal from you, then it sort of does. And so what happens when they talk about shutting down gun rights, right? Gun sales go through the roof. So I don't know. We'll see. The future's yet to be written.
People say, what price would get you to buy Bitcoin? It's not based on price.
Yeah.
It's based on sort of various geopolitical movements where there may very well come a day where I'm going to go, oh shit, these guys are right now. These guys are going to win. They're coming off the battlefield, scarred, bloodied, but alive. And that I don't know what it is I'm going to see. It's like porn. I know it when I see it, maybe. And I don't need to capture the early days because I don't need to go into a fight not knowing who's going to win. So I'm like the U.S. going into World War II. I wait till we're going to win.
Yeah, it's like private equity, right? I mean, you invest in a new company, you don't know if it's going to work, so it's a lot of risk, a lot of upsides. So you take a small pit, small bit at it. But anyway, interesting conversation. It's interesting, especially when you think about your worldview, and our worldview really lines up, right? The decentralization of the world and increased authoritarianism, and and there's equal and opposite reactions. So more authoritarianism squeezing, the more we push back, and then obviously, we didn't get into CBDCs, but
I hate those.
Of course you do, right? And so then it's like, big problems equal big solutions, and then what solutions do we have? And then you kind of go down that rabbit hole, but I don't want to keep going down that. But Yeah, CBDCs, that's the next big piece. Let's just talk about that. I got just a couple minutes left, and you probably do too as well. But on the CBD front, let me just pose this question because it's a big topic. Obviously, China rushed theirs out first. They're a dictator, right? Communist country. In the United States, though, we know the Fed has now said we've been testing the CBDCs to transfer interbank transfers, et cetera. But the Constitution, that pesky document that they keep trying to rewrite, says that the Fed can't create money. Only the Treasury can. So how does the Fed legally today create a CBDC when legally they can't do that without, rewriting the law and a big fight and voting and all that? Like, it doesn't seem like it's a real imminent threat potentially in the United States right now. What's your thought on that?
Well, history shows that I think the Constitution was pristinely clear on money can only be made out of gold and silver. Mm-hmm. And they skipped that part. And so I think that they will do what they want to do. The evidence says they will do whatever they want to do.
But doesn't that take a big process that could be dragged out and people get to voice their opinions, and it probably doesn't happen in the next 12 months?
I'm not sure it does, right? Yeah. I mean, look at the COVID vaccine. Sorry. Look at recent health problems, right? Things happen fast.
Yeah, and we know, to your point, during the pandemic, in the stimulus bills, they were trying to insert some language into that to sneak the CBDs or through. So, there could be something there. But again, back to these warring factions, does the Treasury want to give up control over money to the Fed? And does
Well, here's the thing a lot of people are not talking about. It's minor compared to what you're talking about here, but I think historically, Fed chairs and presidents and administrations have tried to work together. There have been some shoving matches. Supposedly, Lyndon Johnson jammed one of them right up against the wall. But we've got an administration now that looks hopelessly weak. And the other problem that the Fed is facing, which is, I think, unique, is that anything they do to try to tighten is being undone by the extremely generous budgetary moves of the government right now. So what are we growing our debt? 7.5% a year, something like that?
Yeah, crazy.
You cannot inflate away debt that's growing 7.5% a year without the debt being more than 7.5%. And it's kind of right now an upward spiral. And so now here's Powell looking at Biden et al. Saying, holy cow, guys, I'm trying to get a hold of the system. And let's say he's a good guy. I'm trying to get a hold of inflation. I'm trying to get a hold of the system. And you keep passing, global warming bills. And you keep passing bills to send money to Ukraine for no apparent reason. Yeah. Besides the fact that there's a big kickback scheme to the DNC and things like that. Big money's being spent in ways that make the Fed's job harder. And I don't know what that will translate into, but it could translate into the Fed saying to the administration, I'm going to crank rates right up your ass.
Yeah. It seems to be a good probability that happens. Man, with that, we'll go ahead and end it right there. We'll leave a cliffhanger. And if you love this, leave your comments and share it. And maybe we'll talk with Dave again in a little bit later and catch back up on this. Dave, anything you want to draw people's attention to? We'll make sure to link your 2022 report, which is long and worth reading. So I'll link that below. Anything else you want to draw attention to or last words?
No. For me, this year was really about Ukraine and about the U.S. military bad behavior. Stop supporting overseas wars, in my opinion. We're no longer fighting for democracy. We're no longer none of that crap. It's really, we've gone totally off the right. I'm a Reagan Republican. I voted for Bush Senior. I'm not some McCarthy voter. I'm not some Ralph Nader voter. But we've had 252 military adventures overseas since 1991.
Wow.
And now one of those countries attacked us. Not a single one attacked us. Now, there might have been some guy from some cave somewhere who attacked us, from which country we don't seem to know. But no sovereign state attacked us, or why. Yeah. I can give them some reasons why, but 252 times we've intervened. And the question is, are we now officially the bully? Are we the Roman legions in the final stages, stomping around trying to keep the empire from imploding? And it sure looks that way to me.
Yeah. Great finished words there, Dave. I appreciate your time. Really good conversation. I enjoyed it. So with that, we'll go ahead and sign it off. Leave your comments down below. Share this out. Spread the word. And try to think through why. Like, what's really going on? I think that's probably a big takeaway you can get from this. So with that, thank you so much, Dave. All right, that's a wrap. Hopefully you enjoyed this conversation with Dave Collum. It was insightful. It was fun for me to have. I hope that you also enjoyed that as well. Leave me a comment and let me know what you think. I'd love to hear your questions, comments. Gives me ideas to make more videos. Maybe I'll bring Dave back. Of course, as always, what I'm always asking for you to do is take this information and just go discuss it. Share it. Spread these ideas so you can share this video. Of course, click on that like button so more people see it, and then hit that subscribe button so you know when I put new videos out. And that's what I got. All right, to your success. I'm out.